Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Teacher Development Webinars. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Amanullah Sand. I facilitate virtual programs at Teacher Development Webinars. I welcome you all at Teacher Development Webinars. Teacher Development Webinars is a social action project to support teachers and educators around the world with professional development opportunities. It is using the rise in online professional development to connect people from around the world with opportunities which they may not have had due to the old normal of face-to-face conferences. And we are celebrating International Mother Language Day webinar series that aims to celebrate linguistic diversity and multilingualism. We intend to promote awareness of equity and inclusion in education through discussions about linguistic human rights, importance of other tongues, and language sensitization, and other concerns about language. And now for this webinar, it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Dr. Sander Dawson. Dr. Sander Dawson is a senior research fellow at the School of Education, Curtin University, and a Discovery Early Research Fellow of an Australian Research Council. He's also the discipline lead of Applied Linguistics and Languages group of the School of Education, Curtin University. Dr. Dovchin was certified as researcher in the field of language and linguistics under the Humanities, Arts and Literature of the Australian's 2021 Research Magazine and top 250 researchers in Australia in 2021. Her research pragmatically contributes to the second language education of young generation living in the peripheries, providing a pedagogical view to accommodate the multiple coexistence of linguistic diversity in a globalized world. She has authored numerous articles in international and peer-reviewed journals such as Applied Linguistics, International Journal of Multilingualism, Journal of Multicultural Discourses, International Journal of Bilingualism, and among others. She has authored 6 books with international publishers such as Routledge, Springer, Palgrave Macmillan, and Multilingual Matters. What a pleasure it is to have you at Teacher Development Webinars. Dr. Dovchin, welcome to Teacher Development Webinars. Over to you, Dr. Dovchin.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here today. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can.
And can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, and thank you so much for the invitation. So do you want me to share my screen now? Okay.
Sure.
Okay, share my screen. Oh, where is my?
Are you able to share the screen, Dr. Dovchin?
Yeah. Can you see
Yep.
my slide? Yeah. Okay. Oh.
Yep. Perfect.
Okay. Okay. So can I start now?
Wonderful. Go ahead.
Okay. So yes. So thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very honored to be here today for the Teacher Development webinar. Today I'll be talking about my research, which is called Linguistic Racism. So before I begin my talk, I would like to acknowledge the sovereign lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people and pay my respect to the elders past, present, and future. Okay, so so in recent years, there has been an upsurge of linguistic racism-related hate crimes around the world. That means that people, it's basically triggered by, for example, based on how one speaks English or how one speaks its own heritage language and first language. And based on how one person speaks certain language, they can be the victim of the linguistic racism related hate crimes. One of the most concerning one was for example, in the Harlow, Essex, UK, where 6 boys aged 15 and 16 here, they have been questioned over killing of a Polish man allegedly beaten to death after a gang heard him speak a Polish language. So the victim was attacked by a teenage mob as he chatted to his Polish friends outside a pizza takeaway, and he was beaten because he was speaking a foreign language, for example. And there are lots of many examples around the world, which is basically related to, linguistic racism. And there is one also in Australia where Australian National Broadcasting System, ABC Four Corners, investigative journalistic report made huge headlines around Australia because it has revealed how young men in youth detention center in Northern Territory was physically and verbally abused by prison guards and detention center officers. They were chained, hooded, and tear gassed, and stripped and isolated. And later, this case was sent to the Royal Commission for the further investigation. So this has made a huge headline, for example, in Australia. And later, one of the victims, Dylan Waller, he made his statement to Royal Commission, and this is what he said.
Where our crime is our punishment, not the continued mental and physical abuse that we continue to cop while we're here. On a number of occasions, I've witnessed officers abusing and yelling at Aboriginal men in here and putting them down because they can't speak English properly, and that's not fair and needs to stop. As a victim and a young man, I feel upset and let down by the system that these bad things were allowed to go on for so long. I really want to see these things changed so it never happens to anyone else again, and I believe this Royal Commission makes sure that young people need love and someone to talk to, not to be locked in a cell with nothing for days on end. Trust me.
So here, Dylan Waller says that young Aboriginal men were abused by prison guards because they couldn't speak proper English. So this is also one of the examples of the linguistic racism related, abuse that happened, for example, in Australia, which made a big headlines.
Where our crime is our punishment.
So there is also a very big survey outcome, which was conducted in the US, and there were more than 10,000 educators, and 90 of whom are teachers, and they responded to an online survey sponsored by Teaching Tolerance, a project of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And almost 40% of these participants, they have heard a sort of derogatory language use against the students of color and Muslims and immigrants and other students based on gender or sexual orientation, and not only on gender and sexual orientation, but also based on how they speak English or how they speak certain languages and so forth. So this was also one of the very concerning survey outcome. So we, based on all these examples, and based on all these headlines around the world and so forth, our team at Curtin University, we had a project called Linguistic Racism, which was funded by the Australian Research Council. So in our study at Curtin University, we recruited around 150 culturally and linguistically diverse background participants in our research. And these participants were from very, many different backgrounds, including Asian, African backgrounds, Muslim backgrounds. Some of the participants you can see here, Mongolian Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean, Sudanese, and even we have some participants from Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Russia, and also many Aboriginal Australian participants. So what we did was we basically interviewed our 150 participants on a face-to-face basis, and we spoke to them about their everyday lived experience in terms of linguistic racism, or how they have so far experienced racism or discrimination based on how they speak language, for example, or based on how they speak English. And out of this 150 participants, 50 participants were also a part of the focus group discussions. So we invited them at Curtin University, and we had discussions about their lived experience, about how they, how they sort of like experienced language-based discrimination in their everyday lives. Now, based on our research project and research outcome, we have published a special issue called Linguistic Racism for International Journal of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism. And in that special issue, we try to define the term linguistic racism, and we also try to include other research related to linguistic racism that is happening not only in Australia, but also around the world. So you can see here some of the examples of these works which were included in our special issue. And here's some of our works that's, we talk more or less about linguistic racism in our books. So now let me try to define what we mean by linguistic racism. So by linguistic racism, we basically refer to discrimination based on how a person speaks language. So that means that it's not only English, but also it's any language that person speaks. As soon as person open their mouth, they can be the victims of the linguistic racism. So, for example, racism related to one's religion or one's, skin color, nationality, and so forth. They are very much established racisms, but linguistic racism arises basically from the situation where the unfair treatment of individual based solely on the use of language. So sometimes linguistic racism is also can be referred to as linguicism based on Turv Scott-Nam Kanga's definition as well. So also in terms of linguistic racism, not only how one speaks certain languages, but also certain accents or certain dialects. There can be, for example, rural accents or urban accents or dialects and one's repertoires and so forth. And also what kind of languages they speak, for example. And linguistic racism is basically sort of discrimination where, the language users' basic human rights can be under attack due to fundamentally how persons speak certain languages, or sometimes person even that language user is not even allowed to speak certain languages in certain circumstances and contexts. So linguistic racism, we found out that, they can be overt form of linguistic racism, and also there can be introvert sort of form of linguistic racism. So what do we mean by overt form of linguistic racism? So this form of racism is sort of the form of explicit mockery or mimicking, or, certain bad languages against the people, or bullying, or it can also be the malicious sarcasm and so forth. Also, overt linguistic racism can be very much explicit, it can be pretty obvious. It can be sort of like hate speeches online, verbal or written abuse, race hate talks, written discourses which can circulate around social media, and racial slurs or name calling against others based on one's race and ethnicity. So overt linguistic racism is basically, it can be very much explicit, and it can, can be quite obvious. We have seen in our examples, the examples of the overt linguistic racism can be quite, sort of like quite popular, especially in the context of Australia, especially in institutional settings such as schools, for example, or you know, public transportations and so forth. Now, here in the school context, one of my research participants who is from Vietnam, and she moved to Australia when she was in high school. And here she says, I felt very much lost in the environment, and I you know, it was a time that, you know, I thought of depression. And she says that, you know, it was like I was in the class sitting in the group, and then I accidentally talked, like, you know, pronounced wrongly one or two words, and then you know, her classmates, they burst into a laugh. Then I feel like maybe I should shut my mouth and say nothing at all, you know, like and she says it's like bullies. So this kind of this form of racism based on one's mispronunciation is sort of can be considered as the overt linguistic racism, for example. And here is another data examples of the overt linguistic racism here, where one of the research participants from China says, I said something like, my mother set me off instead of my mother told me off in the classroom. And then when teacher asked me a question, and everyone laughed in the classroom, and I was really hurt, and I started crying because you know, I made a mistake, and, you know, unfortunately, I felt very much excluded in the classroom. And then she says that I have always been self-conscious of speaking English in the classroom or in the public since then. So this is this is also the overt form of linguistic racism that this student, you know, faced in Australia. Now, there can be sort of like covert or introvert form of linguistic racism. Now, what do we mean by covert form of linguistic racism here is, for example, giving, you know, making jokes or making inside jokes, or giving compliments to somebody, or, you know, social exclusions from you know, gathering or parties, or even workplace and employment exclusions. So covert linguistic racism can be very much done in a hidden or unnoticed way. And it can also happen, for example, in many institutional settings as well. So, for example, one of my research participants here, she says that, you know, she's Russian, but, you know, the people say that my Russian accent sounds, you know, very, you know, cute, and she feels very uncomfortable about that. And she takes it not as a compliment, but rather as an exclusion, for example. So this is one of the, you know, covert form of linguistic racism. Also, a covert form of linguistic racism can also be experienced at workplace. There are lots of workplaces, for example, in Australia, or employees, they sort of, you know, they do not hire immigrants with English as a second background because of their accents, or because how they speak English, for example. And also not only English accent, but also there are lots of different, you know, layers of linguistic racism in a hidden way. For example, if the migrant is, for example, from France and they can speak French, or the other immigrant is from Mongolia, they can speak Mongolian. Of course, the one who can speak French can be hired, because the immigrant who can speak Mongolian, their language is devalued and they're excluded, and they're not considered as a multilingual or bilingual person, because obviously the Mongolian language is not necessarily very useful in that particular context. And that can be the, you know, hidden form of linguistic racism. So people say it's like, oh, you can speak, you know, Mongolian, you're a very much bilingual person, but in fact, that language is not very much used in terms of hiring order of things, for example. There is another data examples where a researcher is asking about our research participant from Ukraine, and researcher is asking, you know, what kind of challenges you have faced in Australia. And then one of the most obvious examples of the hidden or covered form of linguistic racism was, for example, the names, you know. So here Oksana says that her name sounds a bit like, you know, Ukrainian or even like Russian. And if you have a name that doesn't sound like Anglo name, then, you know, a CV cannot even be considered for job or employment. And you know, she ended up changing her name, and she ended up changing her last name, for example, into her husband's name so that she can sound more English or more Australian. And as soon as she changed her name into Anglo-sounding, Australian-sounding name, she started getting calls from the employers. And there are so many immigrants with non-English sounding names. They informed us that, you know, their CV is never considered for job applications because their name is not English. So this is one of the also very concerning outcome which emerged from our research. The other covered form of linguistic racism is basically also, you know, how our parents are educating their children. For example, they need to encourage their children to speak or to, you know, to make friends with kids with other backgrounds and promote or motivate or encourage their kids, you know, to have this you know, this multilingual, you know, to play, for example, in a multilingual and multicultural environment. But in our research, it showed that, you know, parents seem to not to encourage their kids to play with kids with, for example, non-English speaking backgrounds. And that can be also one part of the covered form of linguistic racism. Now I can also talk a little bit more about the linguistic racism and in relation to COVID. So in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic, which has really overwhelmed the world in the last 2 years, there has been a significant increase in incidence of both explicit and implicit forms of racism, especially against the global Asian community. And several Asian family homes around the world, for example, they have received a lot of explicit forms of linguistic racism, you know, COVID-19, China die, and also Asian students and Asian background doctors, for example, they have been verbally abused, which is also the explicit form of linguistic racism. For example, Wuhan virus or China virus and things like that. And such explicit form of verbal abuse are illustrative of the linguistic racism that people of Asian backgrounds are forced to uncover as the pandemic, for example, widened. So here, you know, because of all these forms of linguistic racism related to COVID-19, we had to rethink about, you know, how linguistic racism can also be, you know, reformed and reformulated in terms of in relation to COVID-19 pandemic. Now, when we talk to, for example, Asian background research participants, the way we talk and the words, for example, they use in the context of COVID-19, we have to be very much careful because it can promote also very much negative perceptions and stigmatization among our research participants. For example, when we talk about coronavirus disease, certain words may hurt our participants, like you are suspect, or, you know, you need to be isolated from the society. And these kind of strong languages may have a very much negative effect for people. And it can also fuel the, you know, stigmatizing attitudes towards people, for example, who are going through this pandemic. And they can also perpetuate existing negative stereotypes, for example, against certain people, against certain nationalities and stereotypes and assumptions. And these can strengthen false associations between the disease and the other factors. And it creates further fear and dehumanize those who have this disease, the disease. So they're talking about people who have COVID-19 or people who are being treated for COVID-19 or people who are recovering COVID-19 rather than cases or victims are much preferred among our research participants, for example, and also talking about people who may have COVID-19 rather than suspect is much preferred among our research participants. And instead of saying people who are infecting others, also our research participants, they said that, you know, talking about people acquiring or contracting COVID-19 is much better way of, you know, not to stigmatize people with COVID-19. Now, so now I would like to talk a little bit about how these forms of linguistic racism is sort of, you know, emerge and what kind of theories are related to understand better linguistic racism. So linguistic racism, you know, the conceptual understanding of linguistic racism is based on recent sort of language and marginalization sort of conceptual frameworks, for example, which is called Unequal Englishes by Ronnie Tupas. And in Unequal Englishes, he argues that today many people speak different kinds of Englishes from different, you know, because they are from different contexts, different time and space, different nationality and culture, they can speak different sort of Englishes. But because how they speak different sort of Englishes, for example, people who are speaking English in the dominant society or the mainstream population in Australia or in the United States or in the UK, mainstream population who are speaking English, their English can be pretty much privileged. Canadian English, American English, Australian English, British English are pretty much, you know, privileged, and they can be really much, you know, very much powerful English compared to English, for example, coming from the global south. So people and immigrants who are speaking English from global south, for example, their English can always be considered in the lower level or, you know, less powerful. So based on how English is, for example, English is, you know, compared, or it can become really unequal, and because people can speak very different sort of English, this is why linguistic racism is, for example, emerging from the theory of unequal Englishes. Another theory which is related to the linguistic racism is, I can also say, racial linguistics, which is also Flores, Nielsen Flores, and Sami Alim, and they talk about language in relation to race. For example, when certain people have certain nationality, ethnicity, and race or skin color, they can speak, they are assumed or stereotyped to speak different kind of English. For example, even though your English is your first language, even though you were born in Australia and your English is your first language, but then if you are the second generation of Australian with Asian background, you are still stereotyped as, not so good English speaker because you don't look, white. So racial linguistics is pretty much related to linguistic racism, how one can be stereotyped based on how they look, how one speaks certain English is based on how they look in terms of their ethnicity, skin color, and so forth, despite their very good English. And also linguistic racism can be related to linguistic diversity and social injustice as well. Even though, for example, Australia or United States or UK, all these English dominant speaking countries, they consider themselves as a multicultural and multilingual, country where they promote multiculturalism and multilingualism. There is only one sort of standard, for example, Australian English or standard American English, where everyone aspires to learn, where everyone is, where everyone wish to speak American English or Australian English. And here, linguistic diversity is also not very well promoted in that context, because English is the main standard language which needs to be spoken, and all other languages, such as languages from immigrants coming from background, coming with the immigrants, for example, they are devalued. So the linguistic diversity is not really well, justified in this linguistically diverse context, for example. So this is also related to the theory of linguistic racism. And in the critical inquiries in the social linguistics of globalization, we also need to consider the fact that linguistic racism, it doesn't only happen in dominant English-speaking countries such as UK or USA or Australia. It can also happen in any sort of context. Now, if we look at, for example, in the context of Japan, in Japan, like Tokyo dialects or Japanese people who speak Japanese in Tokyo or who speak Japanese in Osaka, they can be discriminated against each other, like rural sort of Japanese dialect or rural sort of Japanese accent can be discriminated against the Tokyo dialects. Or in the context of Mongolia as well, where people speak, mainstream populations speak, they speak like, standard Mongolian, whereas people with ethnic backgrounds, for example, the Kazakh Mongolians or Tuva Mongolians, they speak, standard Mongolian a bit differently. So they can also be discriminated as, they're not, standard Mongolian speakers. So in today's social linguistics of globalization, actually linguistic racism is happening in every layers, in every context in society. Now here are some of the examples of linguistic racism which can be, further discovered or further studied in my books. Now, I can also talk a little bit about the negative effect of linguistic racism, which happened, across my research participants. For example, our research participants, they have reported to us that linguistic racism can also cause a major psychological distress. And on top of major psychological damages and distress, it can also physically affect them. So it can also lead to poor health behaviors. We have a example of a Chinese student who studied at one of Australian universities, and he was 24 years old, and he was diagnosed with mental health, illness, and he got severe depression and insomnia, and he got. He started feeling very much socially excluded because of his English skills. So he reported that, when he first came to Australia, he couldn't really communicate with people, and he was ashamed of speaking English. That's why he couldn't go out with, with his classmates, because he was ashamed of speaking English. And because of that, he started having his linguistic inferiority complex, which is a sort of losing his confidence and becoming very much, self-conscious. And he went through a major depression. Here, another example of an international student in Australia who couldn't speak English very well, and he started developing the linguistic inferiority complex, and he took his own life. So a lot of our research participants, they have informed to us that because they can't speak English very well, or because they have been mocked by mainstream population for not speaking correct English, they started, developing linguistic inferiority complex, which led to depression, suicidal ideations, eating disorder, alcohol abuse and drug abuse, and so forth. So here's one of our research participants. She's saying that, she thought of depression, and she wanted to, for example, kill herself because she couldn't speak English, and her English was her only second language, and it really affected her, for example. What I'm trying to say here is that linguistic racism has a major psychological damage and effect to our research participants, and we really need to take it seriously. So as language educators and researchers, I think I would like to say that we need to highlight the importance of combating linguistic racism, and also, studying and discovering more about investigating the language realities and social linguistic realities of people who speak different languages, who speak different Englishes. For example, in Australian context, for example, we need to be cautious about how we speak to immigrants or how we speak to international students, because it can have a real psychological effects on them. And in that way, we can assist them in adapting to any new societies and help them to regain at least some degree of power and equality in both institutional and personal environment. So as language educators and teachers and researchers, we also need to raise awareness among mainstream population, how it can affect other marginalized groups, marginalized people, when they become the victim of linguistic racism. So this is really basically what I want to discuss today. So thank you very much. So I will finish my talk now, and if you have any questions, please welcome.
Thank you very much for your insights, Dr. Sander. We really appreciate your participation here. And now let me read out some of the questions. So Naeem Akhtar asked that, does linguistic racism vary person to person and place to place and region to region, language to language?
Sorry, can you please repeat? I couldn't hear.
Yes, he asked that, does linguistic racism vary person to person and place to place, or region to region, and language to language?
Yeah. So the theory of linguistic racism is basically based on latest conceptual frameworks in relation to language and marginalization. So when we talk about linguistic racism, we're not only talking about one's race, skin color, it's more than that. It's the intersectionality of one's, culture, race, ethnicity, even the social class, the background, the background of the first language, and the dialects and accents. So when we talk about racism, we are looking at the new forms of racism. Racism is not only about just one's race. Racism is more than that. It's about the intersectionality of the discrimination. So linguistic racism is a part of, a bigger picture of the discrimination, but it's the least studied part of the discrimination. When we talk about discrimination and racism, we always talk about, for example, skin color, or for example, we talk about religion and things like that. But, language is always the part of the racism. So what we are trying to argue is linguistic racism is the bigger picture of it's the intersectionality of the particular person's identity, and it plays an important role.
All right, I see this question from Fatima. She says, how can we as teachers improve our linguistic skills to be a good model for students?
I think as teachers, in my opinion, we don't, we don't need to improve our linguistic skill to impress our students, because this is who we are. This is how we speak. We should be proud ourselves. We should be proud of ourselves, and we should show ourselves, you need to be proud of yourself too. And, this is how I speak. This is how I was brought up. This is what I learned. This is my life journey. So this is my social linguistic background. This is my identity. So this is the, main lesson that we should teach to our students, instead of like forcing yourself. For example, I need to improve my linguistic skill, or I need to improve my English to impress my students. But rather than that, you need to show your students who you are as a person.
Great. Dr. Tahira Khanam asked that, does it belong to different varieties of the same language too?
Of course, yes, the same language group. For example, when I talk about Mongolian language, right? So Mongolian language has this one standard Mongolian language, and then it has some different dialects from different regions of Mongolia. And when these different parts of different dialects and accents from Mongolia, Mongolian language, they can be discriminated against each other. So linguistic racism also can be a part of the varieties within the same language. So when we talk about the linguistic racism in English, for example, English is just one big language, right? But then people who speak English differently, they always become the victims of the linguistic racism. So English is the one same language, but there are lots of different varieties, accents, and dialects based on that particular person's social linguistic background. So linguistic racism is pretty much based on also on the same language.
All right, so Nome from Nigeria asked that my question on the theme of the webinar is, what are the negative impacts and maybe positive impacts of linguistic discrimination or racism?
I need to listen to the question again. What was the question?
Yeah, Nome asked that what are the negative impacts or positive impacts of linguistic discrimination or racism?
What are the negative effects of the linguistic racism?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
exactly.
as I mentioned in my slides, in the last section, last part of my slides, the negative effect of the linguistic racism is it can damage one's mental health well-being. And when one's mental health well-being is damaged, it can further actually negatively impact one's physical health, right? So we had examples from our research participants who were the victims of the linguistic racism, and it affected them really badly in terms of their mental health well-being. They started thinking of, thinking of suicides, or they also started going through depression. Some of the girls, they started developing eating disorder. And then all these negative effects, they can basically affect one's physical health, So it has basically what we have found out in our research is it has a direct relation, linguistic racism has a direct relation to one's negative psychological, well-being, psychological health.
That's great. She says that very interesting example. I'm a speaker of Osaka dialect, the discrimination of Osaka dialect speakers as well. I'm not sure discrimination is the best word to describe, but I feel Osaka dialect speakers are perceived somewhat.
Yeah. You know, I lived in Japan for a couple of years, and I know these sort of exclusion or discrimination in Japan, for example. So when we talk about discrimination, we're talking about exclusion, right? So when certain people speak certain dialects, say like Osaka dialect, they can be excluded from other social groups. So I would say that discrimination is basically the social exclusion. You know, they make, as I mentioned in my slides, you know, there are forms of overt linguistic racism or covert linguistic racism. I guess these are all part of the discrimination. So yes, so I feel that, you know, also dialect is also sort of a part of the linguistic racism, even though, you know, Japanese people, they look the same in terms of race, but they can discriminate to each other in terms of how they speak Japanese.
That's correct. So Jongyu asks, thanks. What's your pedagogical view for linguistic diversity?
My pedagogical view
For linguistic diversity, yep.
So as I said, as you know, as social linguists and applied linguists and teachers and educators, we really need to highlight the importance of the linguistic diversity. But when we highlight the importance of the linguistic diversity, we also need to be very careful, because when we talk about linguistic diversity, we really need to talk about how people speak certain languages based on their own identities, based on their social linguistic backgrounds and who they are. You know, we shouldn't be promoting linguistic diversity in terms of, you know, we need to strive to learn American English or British English and we need to speak perfect English. Rather, we need to promote that individual, how they speak that particular language. For example, if that person speaks Chinese and English and Japanese and multilingual, we need to, for example, promote that rather than criticizing people for speaking bad English. So my view in terms of pedagogical view of linguistic diversity is we need to promote speakers as who they are, and we need to promote their linguistic identity rather than forcing them to speak certain standard language.
That's great. And there's a comment, I think Chinese characters data is vital for understanding Korean, Japanese, Chinese, and Vietnamese. Is there an attempt in university for understanding East Asian linguistic diversity?
East Asians linguistic diversity.
Yep.
I think, for example, in my university, at Curtin University, where I'm based right now, we have a language group where we teach Japanese and Chinese. So we have a lot of students, local students, for example, from Australia who want to study Japanese and Chinese. So they enroll at our department to study these East Asian languages. But, you know, we don't teach Korean, Vietnamese, but we do, you know, teach, we do have courses and subjects, which is, for example, called Language and Diversity in Eastern Asia, Language and Communication in Eastern Asia. And there we talk about the cultural issues and linguistic issues, the social issues, financial, political issues in East Asia, not only just the linguistic diversity, we also want to learn more about their cultures. So in terms of cultural classes, we do have classes that we teach about China, we teach about Vietnam, all these East Asian countries, but yeah, we only teach Chinese and Japanese at the moment.
Great. So there's this question from Amiri Uchana from Israel, and she asked, what language would be considered a neutral language to enable equal communication? I would say, do we need a neutral language?
Can you please repeat what language?
Yeah, she says, what language would be considered a neutral language to enable equal communication?
Neutral language.
Yeah.
What language can be considered as neutral language?
Yeah.
In terms of which context? In the classroom?
Yeah, to enable equal communication. I would say, from my point of view, do we need a neutral language or equal communication?
Okay, so neutral language, I'm not sure what you mean by neutral language or neutral communication, but for example, when you live in multicultural country like Australia or United States and UK, English is the lingua franca. But when we talk about English as a lingua franca, it's not necessarily has to be standard Australian English or standard American English, because the immigrants from different countries, say like an immigrant from Pakistan or an immigrant from India, immigrant from China, they all speak different Englishes. And then English becomes the main neutral language, but it doesn't have to be the standard English. It can be just that person's English. That's the neutral way of communicating. And I think in this webinar, in this teacher development webinar that we are speaking right now, of course we are speaking English, but we are all speaking different sort of Englishes. So that's our neutral communication, I think.
Wonderful. What an apt example. And this leads me to my next question. Mahmoud asks, is it related to game power? Is power relations or power responsible for this linguistic racism?
Yeah, I think linguistic racism is very much related to the power game, in my opinion, because one sort of language is very much powerful compared to other languages. And why? Of course, the power is related. So this is linguistic racism is the I think it's the it's the cause of the unequal power relations between institutions, between individuals, between people, and it's the unequal power in relation to different languages. As I said, when you come to Australia, and if you speak, for example, French or German or Italian, you can be powerful because these languages can be powerful, But then if you speak like Mongolian in Australia, it's not very powerful. So because, it's not very useful. So linguistic racism is the result of the unequal power relations. That's one of the points that I need to highlight. So I do agree. There is also one. There is also one question that I think one person asked about the written language.
Sure, if you can see this.
Yeah, here.
Yeah, Ruqayya asked that, can you please add few words on linguistic racism in orthography or writing system?
Yeah, I think in orthography, linguistic racism also does exist. So, social media like Facebook or Twitter and Instagram, there are a lot of written discourses or orthography in relation to discrimination and racism. And there are lots of online hate speeches and written discourses and forms. And these are all part of the linguistic racism, which is in written form. So linguistic racism can be in the form of written discourse and verbal discourse.
Great. So there's this question from Khalil Ahmed, and he asks how to create a culture of care that takes into account the socio-emotional needs of minoritized speakers.
how to
create a culture of care that takes into account the socio-emotional needs of minoritized speakers.
So yes, one of the main important things to to prevent the linguistic racism in terms of minority speakers is, we need to work with them. We need more research and studies, and we really need sort of like insiders' perspective as well. So we need to work with them more. We need to go into their world. We need to understand their lived experience. We need to see through their own eyes. We need to understand what they're thinking, what they're feeling, what they have experienced. Otherwise, we would never be able to find out what's really happening. So my research at Curtin University is only the beginning. We only worked with around 150 people. And when we worked with these 150 people, we only just interviewed them about 1 hour or so. But we need more, longitudinal ethnographic studies where we work together for a longer time. We need to understand what is really happening in these people's world. And then after that, we need to have a scientific evidence what's really happened to these people, what's happening, what will happen. And based on this scientific evidence, we need to intervene, we need to have interventions, and we need to also inform policymakers, decision makers, educators, academics, what is really happening with these people. And also we need to raise the public awareness about minoritized speakers and linguistic racism, because linguistic racism is very, very, sort of like, it's very common in the society, but it's one of the least discussed topics in the society as well. So we as language teachers, we as teachers and educators in applied linguistics, we really need to promote why language is really important for people, As soon as they're open their mouth, people's mind change. So language is very important for one's identity and one's sense of belonging. So that would be my answer for that.
Yeah, and also I think we should get out of this time. We should get out of this myth of standardization. So as long as you can understand me and we are serving the common purpose, it's all right. And so this is about acknowledging all the accents, all the dialects, all the languages. And if I talk about in the context of Pakistan, so we are a multilingual nation, and we have Urdu as the official language, and also the English. But then Urdu has had to replace the English, and we are unable to do so after so long. But then, if we see at the provincial levels, Sindhi, Punjabi, Pashto, or Balochi, or Brahvi, considered major languages of the provinces. But then again, Sindhi in Sindh province is dominating, and all the minority languages, and likewise. Yeah,
I absolutely agree, and that's a very thought-provoking opinion. I mean, that's a very thought-provoking thing to say, because we all speak differently. After all, we are all human beings, and human beings are diverse. The basis of human beings are we are diverse, but we do speak language. We have one human language, but we speak differently. So we need to embrace ourselves as language educators, how human language can be diverse. And that's the linguistic diversity we're talking about. We're not talking about the linguistic diversity, which is this language is standard, that language is standard. That's why this person speaks differently, unstandard language, and he needs to be excluded, Instead of that, we need to embrace all the diversity we have.
Yeah, I agree. And there's this question from Khalid here: is linguistic diversity mainly based on phonological diversity?
Yeah, the phonological diversity is about how the person's pronunciation, right? Phonetics and pronunciation. So that is called accentism or accent. So when person speaks mispronounce the words differently, or if the person speaks English through different accents, say like Indian English, right, or Singaporean English, they can be excluded and become the victims of linguistic racism. So yeah, linguistic racism is part of the phonological discrimination, which we call it accentism or dialectism.
Thanks very much, Dr. Sander Dawson, for your time and expertise and for sharing your wonderful research with us. And I think it will open venues for research for other researchers who are interested in this field, and they can go about it and explore further. We really appreciate your time and expertise. Thanks to Curtin University. And yeah, if you're interested in this webinar recording, this recording will also be available at the Teacher Development Webinars YouTube channel. Please feel free to share with your colleagues and scholars. And if you want certificate for this session, you can contact on info.tdwebinars@gmail.com. We are hosting this International Mother Language Day webinar series, and for our future webinars, you can always see our website www.tdwebinars.org. We are available on all social media channels: Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube channel. Twitter handle is @tdwebinars. Please don't forget to tag us with your takeaways from this webinar and other webinars. So we'll meet in our next webinar. Till then, take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was my pleasure to talk to you about my